Cliff, thank you so much for taking time to be here and to share who you are and what you're doing with our community with Conscious Nashville. I know I appreciate it. And we spoke, if anybody in the community wants to go back through the archives and the podcast, we spoke a good year and a half ago.
It's about a year ago.
And so I'm excited to hear what's been happening. And of course, you are the owner of the Spiral Ridge Permaculture Center.
It's just a company, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to share with our community a little bit about that. Let's start there.
Well, Spiral Ridge Permaculture is a world-class provider of education in the fields of regenerative agriculture and permaculture and ecological design. And we basically teach and host many courses throughout the year in Tennessee and other places, sometimes even internationally. And then we also own another company now called New Agrarian Design, which is our design firm. So we're collaborating with landscape architects, all kinds of different other professionals from across the world and from local area. And in order to develop permaculture homesteads, regenerative farms and ranches, and what would be called sustainable developments. Redesigning old neighborhoods. We're finding that the trends now are that people aren't wanting golf courses anymore. They're wanting farms.
Right.
So that's...
So what... You said something about the neighborhoods. Regenerative neighborhoods? Is that what you said?
Well, we like to call them regenerative because we find to sustain is not good enough.
Right. I hear. Yeah,
and when we say regenerative is that when we design those systems, they start to regenerate themselves after a while. So it's less and less work over time.
So what does a regenerative neighborhood look like?
A regenerative neighborhood would look like, let's take for instance the roads would harvest water that would bring it back into the landscape and also feed into ponds, which would actually create wildlife habitats and fish habitat. And it would also create houses that are naturally built or green.
Right.
And that collect rainwater, that utilize their gray water and compost their own manures and different things like that, and compost food items. But then they would also have integrated within those systems, they would have farms. And those farms would be hopefully regenerative, and where the water from the roads or the access routes would actually feed the soil. The best place to store water is in the soil. And these neighborhoods, if they're designed correctly, can sequester carbon from the atmosphere, reversing global warming. And agriculture can, of course, cause that problem, but it can also reverse it, we're finding.
How do you sequester carbon? How does that work?
Well, there's a lot of carbon that's in the atmosphere, almost close to 400 parts per million right now. A safe place to be is at 350, let's say, or a little less. The soil and the grass, actually, they hold. To sequester means to hold. So the more humus and the more topsoil that we create, and the more grasses and trees and things that are grown, the more carbon is held within, taken out of the atmosphere and held within the soil.
Okay. And
so basically reversing global warming.
Wow, that's very impactful.
Yes.
Definitely. And then you were saying roads, roads that would actually capture water or help us.
Yes.
So is there a specific type of asphalt, or is there just a design? How does that work? It's
just a design.
Okay.
How you build those roads and what material is kind of up to the developer, most likely. But the lay of the road on the landscape and how it traverses the landscape can actually be what is called slightly off contour. So the elevation just slightly moves downhill, bringing the water from the road into the landscape and then into ponds, and then spread out throughout the landscape, holding the water in the ground, almost as like a battery, so that through times of drought, the water is being held within the soil.
So if it's held within the soil, then how do you access it?
The plants access it.
The plants access
So
it.
plants and trees are mechanical pumps.
Uh-huh.
They pull water from the soil into the atmosphere, creating humidity and clouds. And then the opposite happens too. They also bring things from the atmosphere into the soil. So they're actually a mechanical pump that works in a cyclical way.
Wow. And it's nature.
It's nature.
Yeah.
These are all simple systems that nature's designed.
Now, one thing it's delicate, but I have to touch on it because you mentioned it, and it's intriguing, is the idea of, to put it politely, us handling our own waste management.
Yes.
Okay, so instead of having a sewer system or instead of having a septic tank, so one of the things that's an issue, like in India or so forth, where they actually do use their scat to fertilize.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sickness with that because of the E. coli.
Yes.
So how would we handle that?
The key element is to add enough carbon, which are brown materials, that can basically dispose of the nitrogen, and it creates a healthier atmosphere. Whereas in places like India or other places in the world, they're not using the carbon to at the right ratio to the nitrogen, which is the manure or the food scrap, and that creates a cesspool for bad bacteria and parasites and all things to. So basically, it's the environment that you're creating, and all it simply is an element that's missing called carbon.
Okay. So obviously there would be a system in place. We're not necessarily talking about going and digging a hole and
No.
burying.
No.
Okay, all right.
No.
So there's definitely a system in place, and there's education on that.
Yes.
And that would go into house design itself,
Yes.
right?
The other way to take care of that is to use plants. Instead of having septic and sewer systems, we can create wetlands. The work of John Todd is crucial in some of these larger scale systems where there's a lot of humans involved, and there's a lot of feces involved, and there's a lot of other things involved. Those living systems and the plants can actually access the nitrogen and excess nutrients that the manures and everything have, and they can clean the water and actually create a lovely habitat. So they're called constructed wetlands.
Constructed wetlands, okay. So really, in truth, the answer for regenerating and which is the step beyond sustainability, is to go back to nature.
Yes.
Okay. But we are so outside of that box now.
Yes.
It seems almost radical.
Yeah.
Right. So
common sense is not so common anymore.
Right. How can we adjust? How can we start to consider what living like that might mean?
Well, we have to adjust the climate between our ears. And that takes some awareness and some education, and also maybe some entrepreneurs. I believe that entrepreneurs are in a role that can help lead these movements, and will actually help lead the government to believe in these things as well. And I think we need models.
Right. Models
that work, and there are models out there. There's Village Homes in Davis, California, that's been around for over 30 years.
And that's a regenerating. It's
regenerating.
So that's practicing all the principles that you just.
Permaculture in a village setting.
Okay.
Yes, or a development setting or a subdivision setting. There's also farms that are doing this as well. And there are people like Eric Tonesmeyer up in Massachusetts who has a small little urban lot that's 1/10 of an acre growing over 200 different species of plants.
Wow.
That's medicinals, that's food, that's fuel, that's all kinds of things. So I think it's a matter of having podcasts and having information out there like what you're doing here, and also having models that can be easily replicated.
Well, and also I think it's important that everybody understands that what we're talking about here is a solution. It's actually a real solution. It's not speculative. It's not debatable. It's not subject to some kind of testing. It really is a solution.
Yes.
So how would one's lifestyle really change if you go into a regenerative community? How does your lifestyle change from how it is today?
Well, hopefully you're using technology wisely so that you have more time and you've developed your systems to where they are kind of taking care of themselves. It's not like the labor of cotton farming, and that, when someone says they want to be a farmer nowadays, people kind of go, why? But it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. We focus a lot on perennial crops, so nut trees as opposed to rice, which is highly cultivated. Using technology.
So, and that's important to point out that this is not an anti-technology. Let's throw out all these great gifts that we've actually been given and developed over time. That's very important because a lot of times people hear this and they think, oh God, we're going back to the pioneer days.
No.
We have to give it all up, and that's not it. Right?
This is about conscious decision making and holistic decision making, and creating our life in a way that's less stressful. Using technology, it's integrative. It's very integrative. You use technology that works. I would much rather do design and consulting as much as I can online than flying to South America to do a consult.
You don't need to do that anymore. It's really true.
You really don't. And it's really obvious. I think that people's lives would tend to be a little bit easier and less stressful. They would have more times for their kids.
Probably be less sickness because that travels in planes really well.
Yeah.
And the one
it travels in farms and in community.
And the one thing I think is fascinating is this movement has the green movement has been going on for a long time, and I remember when I was little that there was this whole thing about the aerosol cans, and you don't use the aerosol cans, and that they're really affecting the environment. And I don't dispute that, I'm certain.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting is that there's never really a discussion about the jet planes
No.
that are going overhead, and I appreciate that there's a necessity to air travel, although I think maybe we have the technology to perhaps do it differently at this point. But still, it's interesting how we get bits and pieces of information, but we really don't get the whole bite, if you will. We just get the nibble, and then none of us really know what to do.
Right.
And then we listen to people who are trying to poo-poo it all and say, no, it's not really, you don't really have to do this. It's all fine. In fact, I was watching a very popular show a little while ago that was talking about how we should just be using coal. And it for me personally, that's upsetting. Just because of what I've learned and how I seem to perceive it. But for somebody like you, where you really, this is your life, this is your passion. When you hear that conversation come up and people say, oh, well, areas of the world don't have energy, we should just be using coal. What's the response that you feel for that?
Well, coal is ancient sunlight, and it's from plants that have decayed over time, creating, which is a plant is a solar collector, and it's created a substance called coal. Well, every morning, from what I know of, the sun rises in the east, and goes over the sky
Yes.
and sets in the west, as we know it today in our narrative. So why not just use that energy, that very powerful
available energy that's showing up every day,
and mimic what the plant does through photosynthesis to create energy? It creates energy very well. It's a very good energy transfer. So we can look at those and do biomimicry in a way. So we mimic biology, and we can find a lot of answers out from just looking at those simple things. Looking at a whale and how its fins are made. And then they're using that technology and that information to readapt the airplane so that it actually flies through the air better, using less fuel. Even though I still don't like the combustion engine.
Right.
But that's another topic.
Sure, it is, definitely. So now people can come out to your Spiral Ridge, right? They can come out for education, and
we have educational events at our homestead, but we also have a lot of educational events. We have one this year in North Carolina. We have a couple that are on the farm community, and we have other ones in Wisconsin, and So they're all over the place. All you have to do is look on our website under events, and it's even better if you sign up for the newsletter, www.spiralridgepermaculture.com, and you can find a whole listing of what events we're part of and where we're going and what we're doing. And we have a blog, active blog. We actually farm, so we don't just design. We do it too.
So you practice what you preach.
We practice what we
design.
preach. Yes.
So, that's good. So Cliff, what put you on this road? Because it's a great road. It's definitely one that is not necessarily. I think it's far more common than we might realize, in that there's a lot of people really in this movement all over the world.
Yes.
But still, it's not typically something when you're at a party that you meet somebody that does what you do, or you're out at dinner, or you're graduating or whatever, that you're really seeing somebody that's doing what you do. So what brought this around for you?
Well, I personally, I went to school and got a degree in philosophy, and I also got a degree in political science. And that didn't really do it for me. I read Thoreau, and I went on a sojourn, and I started hiking and going and doing retreats, and I learned a lot of different things, and that highly influenced me and my trajectory. And I realized that I wanted to do something good in life, and that my spirituality was going to be in action, and that anything that I was bringing from these retreats needed to be brought forth in action, in positive solutions, on the ground solutions, practical solutions. And then I was encouraged by a lot of mentors throughout the way, and I selected those all in the way, and that's where I'm at today. Also a lot of I would say a lot of stumbling forward.
Right.
Just not knowing where you're going, but you know that you're going somewhere.
Well, that's the perfect argument for you don't have to know how.
No.
You just be. You just move.
Yes.
And it will show up.
Yes.
And that's where most people stop, is trying to figure out the how, and then they don't do what it is that you're doing. Because if you actually had to sit down to figure out how to do all of this, you probably wouldn't have.
Well, there's not very many, graduate degrees in these things, and the graduate degree is in 15 years of my life traveling around, working in the tropics, working in the desert, working in all these different places, just with practical, just learning practical skills and knowledge. And I'm also a very big fan of indigenous people, and I look to them for a lot of support and information, and I always will. And I look to my ancestors and as well. So I'd say it's a kind of a fractal of a journey that goes all over the place all at one time. But
it's all part of the consciousness of life, right? So with where you are right now and putting all of this forth and being part of this movement, what's the biggest stumbling block that you're facing?
I would say that the biggest stumbling block is basically the lack of education out there and people, the knowledge. We need more publications, more books, and I'm seeing it more and more. I'm seeing it's happening very quickly. And it's almost like the 100th monkey soon, at some point.
Yes.
So I would say that's the biggest thing, is just raising the consciousness about it, and getting people to understand, and working on that climate between the ears.
And again, providing the examples, continuing to provide the examples, and perhaps having media in its own form, independent media probably to start with anyway, beginning to expose communities and teach and do exactly what you're saying. And yes, more books. And unfortunately, people aren't really reading that much anymore, but they are watching videos.
Right.
So we just have to keep moving along with the times. And when people do get to discover this, what do you think that really propels them forward? I mean, what's the deciding factor? Because you've obviously been privy to choices being made and people deciding to move forward, or projects moving forward. What do you think the common thread is in all of that?
To get people to why they're doing this? Well, there's several. Some is fear, honestly. Some is fear of financial collapse, just the collapse of a lot of different things, resource collapse, pollution, all these different things.
Right.
So,
Well, if fear in this regard takes people into creating regenerative community, and then you know what? That's a good motivator.
it's a catalyst.
Because there's a balance with that. Because there's the fear that takes them into the, digging,
Right.
they're living in their bomb shelter with other. So I think this is the better side of fear. And there's a choice. We don't have to become survivalists in that sense. We can become regenerists. Right. There we go. Okay.
I
so
think
fear.
health is really a big issue. We're starting to get pretty clear evidence that food is important.
Yeah.
And healthy food is really important. And a healthy diet and clean air, clean water, no fluoride in your water. Just these simple things, no Monsanto, these types of things are really starting to get people to think and waken. And I think there's other levels that are subtle in the stars, so to speak. But that might be another, like I said, another conversation. But,
yes.
I think there's a lot going on, and there's many variables, but I find those to be the common thread. And people I find a lot of baby boomers miss their grandparents. And they're always talking, when I'm walking their farms with them and their homesteads, they're talking about how they remember waking up in the morning with the wood fire and the biscuits and the fresh coffee and the smells and the aunts and the uncles and everybody there, like a family.
Community.
People, yeah.
Right.
And ultimately...
Or your tribe.
Ultimately, what we are doing is we are trying to repair culture. And ultimately, we're creating a language in order to create the culture that we want for the future. And what creates that language, I find, for the most part, in most indigenous societies, is their interaction and connection to the land, to nature. So nature creates the language.
It's common ground, for sure. Yes.
Right. And the language creates the culture.
With this movement, important question, which is, the youth of today. And I think that what you're talking about with missing their grandparents or really kind of finding a way back to, I think people are craving something more in this life. And they're realizing it's not in being busy all the time, and it's not in rushing all the time, and it's not in that, executive position. Most of those are going away these days too. But there's something else. And I think that something else is part spirit, and spirit is earth. So I think there's definitely some strong motivation. We're being driven as an evolution. I think in order to serve evolution, we're being driven in that direction. What is your feeling on the youth of today? Do they get it more? Or are they getting more disconnected? Because I think there's...
Well, I think there's a couple of answers I think one thing is that they're really disconnected from nature, and they want it. Another thing is they're not being initiated properly in society as young males and young females.
Right.
Initiation rites are huge within indigenous cultures. The other thing is I think they get it. They just don't fit in the system, and they don't fit into the school where you sit at a desk,
right,
and the bell goes off. They're not. They're just.
Personally, I couldn't.
They're
stand
not
that.
there.
Yeah, I understand. So
And,
they get it, but maybe they don't quite know what to do with it yet.
Right.
So we need a lot more of you out there.
Well, we need a lot more mentors.
Yes.
We need people who are gonna, from their hearts, mentor the youth, and I think that we all need to stand up to that one.
And I think we've also got to realize that, we've been very blessed. We've had systems in place for a long time that have taken care of a lot of things, good, bad, or indifferent. But we have become very complacent because of that. And we have this tendency now, we're so busy and we're trying to do all and we're so caught up in the doing, trying to figure out how, that we're missing the reality that really it comes back to each one of us. we are ultimately accountable. We're the only things that we can do anything about.
Mm-hmm.
And then the community that we can be a part of,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing as a community that we are it. We make the choices. We make the decisions. I think we really have to stop relying on this illusion that there's any kind of system or organization in place beyond educating us, perhaps, that is really going to do it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Because I don't think they are. I think we
No.
have to.
I do too.
Right?
Yeah.
So, okay, how do people get in touch with you, Cliff?
Well, info@spiralridgepermaculture.com and www.spiralridgepermaculture.com.
And can you spell permaculture?
Yes, PERMA, so perma, like permanence, and culture, CULTURE.
And Spiral Ridge.
Yes,
So, okay, and that's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
that's the best way to get in touch with us.
Any upcoming events you'd like? Well, you know, I'm not sure exactly when this is going to broadcast, so I would be talking about maybe upcoming events in the summer of 2014.
We
or
have
the fall
some
of
very good events
2014.
coming up in the summer. We have some professional designers coming to teach a course in keyline design planning for larger regenerative agriculture systems. We have someone coming to teach, Owen Hublutzel, to come and teach holistic management. We also have an applied watershed restoration course. So this is a course that will teach people about the theory of induced meandering and how water systems work and how we can heal the watersheds. And we also have another big one for the first time on the East Coast, Permaculture for Educators. So it's a permaculture course directed towards teachers and training teachers on how they can bring permaculture into their curriculums in schools.
Wow, that's a big one.
That's a big one.
deal. So they can find all this information on your website.
Yes,
So once again, that website is www.
spiralridgepermaculture.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
sharing with us and educating and sharing a little of your journey. I really appreciate it. I
Yeah,
look forward
thank you.
to continuing the conversation down the road.
Same
and,
here.
and I wish you just much abundance.
Thank you.
And
You
until
too.
next time, I'm Deborah Bishop, and this is Coffee with Conscious Nashville.